Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. Just before I hand over, I'm going to do some housekeeping. Please keep your mic and video turned off. During the discussion, please either type your question in the chat box or raise your hand before unmuting and speaking to the group. We will have a Q&A session. If you have questions during the presentations, please enter them in the chat with the speaker you are directing the question to. Please note that this forum is recorded and will be made available to the public. If you do not want to be seen or heard, but want to participate, please note that you can make yourself anonymous by changing your name and leaving your questions in the chat. If you have any issues, please send me a private message. If you would like to be added to the mailing list, you can also send me a message during the session or by email afterwards. Today's topic is working towards sustainable economies in the mining sector and will be chaired by the brilliant Tapiwa Chimbganda. Over to you, Tapiwa.
Okay, let me just share my. Okay, thank you for that introduction, Aisha. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Minerals to Metals online forum. Today's session is going to be around post-mining transformation and transitions, and hopefully we can also open up the conversation to really talking about what does making the transition work really mean. Just to give the session context, South Africa has a legacy of 6,000 abandoned mines which have resulted in severe environmental impacts, but subsequently legislation has changed, or rather changed, to require mines to be rehabilitated to or returned or reverted into a natural state. But we know because of the nature of mining, landscape alteration is irreversible. And as such, a lot of large scale mines in South Africa actually haven't, clearly, definitely closed or transitioned into what we can clearly identify as a post-mining land use. And with that, last year, the NEMA, financial provisions under NEMA were actually amended to rather now reword the stance and say that the land should be rehabilitated to a sustainable end state. But even with that, what does that really mean for a South African context where you have communities who are not only in close proximity to mines, but are also dependent on mines for infrastructure, services, and livelihoods? So what does that really entail? What does sustainable end state entail? And I know Carolyn and I had quite an intense conversation the other day about different aspects in terms of what does closure mean, closure certificates, and care and maintenance, and the whole dynamics of liabilities getting transferred when mines get sold off. And I think today's topic is really quite topical and very and very current, because at the current stage with COVID and all the disruptions in the global economy, a lot of commodity prices have become very volatile, and we're already seeing a lot of companies announcing either indefinite closures or putting mines on care and maintenance. So again, with that, what does the future look like with commodity prices which are volatile, and as well some mines which are coming to the end of the mine life? So minerals to metals is quite post-mining economies is actually quite a key research area that Minerals to Metals is interested in, with projects like the Community of Practice project, which started I think 2 years ago in collaboration with Mineral Law in Africa, Center for Bioprocessing Engineering and Developmental Policy Unit. And that project was really interesting in looking at using fibrous crops for post-mining industrial development. But again, even though the project was in its conceptual state, I think some of the interesting questions which really came out is that, okay, if we have identified a certain end use, how does that transition happen? Who takes the project forward? And I'm hoping today Caroline will start off with telling us or taking us through the journey and really setting the scene on some of the challenges around mine closure. Mike will then come in and talk about post-mining economies, and Jesse will close the conversation and talk about just transitions into low carbon economies, and then we'll open up the floor to hopefully a good open discussion about all these aspects. Without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Caroline.
Thank you, Tapiwa. I'm going to try and share my screen, and if you can bear with me for a moment while I try and launch this. Hello, everybody. I'm delighted to take you through a little journey on mine closure, current practices and challenges. And I want to start by playing this little video from the International Council on Mining and Metals, which they used last year to launch their revised mine closure guidelines. It's just less than 2 minutes, but let's have a look at it first.
Closure of a mining operation in
Just take that back.
Mineral resources are finite, making the eventual closure of a mining operation inevitable. Leaving a community with a sustainably rehabilitated landscape benefits everyone. The local community, the ecosystem, and the reputation of the company. Planning for closure needs to be a collaboration between governments, industry, and communities to both understand and address the environmental, social, and economic impacts. An integrated approach to closure ideally begins before any activity at the site takes place and is developed and implemented throughout the lifetime of the mine. Responsible closure involves the removal of all infrastructure and facilities, the rehabilitation of surface land, and taking all necessary measures to ensure community livelihoods are sustainable beyond the life of the mine. A wide variety of alternative and exciting uses for post-closure landscapes are available, from wildlife habitat, forestry and agriculture, to myriad recreational uses. To mine with principles is to plan, design for and fulfill closure strategies that sustainably manage the natural resources and biodiversity of our planet, enhancing the social well-being of local communities. Our Integrated Mine Closure Good Practice Guide provides mining companies with the information needed to effectively
So, interestingly enough, that was the second edition of the ICMM closure guidelines. The first one was published 10 years earlier, and a comparison between the first edition and the second edition, it really gives you a good insight into how rapidly the mine closure space and the debate about what good practice is has changed in the last decade. As you can see here, there are a number of other resources that have been published recently. I think particularly noteworthy are in November, Anglo American made the third version of its mine closure toolbox available to the public. And they have the toolbox, and they also have a very substantive report on examples of mine closure, which I think is well worth having a look at. But you can see also there's been work done by the Intergovernmental Forum representing 76 national governments, and they've produced a checklist for governments. There's been work done by the Australian government, Canadian government, and increasingly there's mine closure work being done by the NGOs. And I think Jessie will talk about some of the work she's doing. I've been looking at the Stockholm Environment Institute's work on just transitions and closure as well. So way more than in the recent years, there really are a lot more resources available as mine closure has moved up the political agenda. We've basically in 25 years moved from a lock the gate and throw away the key to a situation where we want to leave the industry is talking about leaving a positive legacy, transforming old mine sites to new uses that create more jobs that were there before, and prosperity in the region long after mining has ceased to exist. If we have a look, I rather like this graphic from the IGF's checklist for government. It's a hierarchy of closure needs. It's quite useful in understanding the state of play of where mine closure regulation is. If we look at the basic closure needs requirements at the bottom there, we can see physical and chemical stability. And then as you move up through the layers, you have more demanding calls for community participation in transformation, in the transition, biodiverse landscapes and prosperous communities, leading to the top, the Sustainable Development Goals meeting, hopefully. And there are some success stories. I think even as we've seen that the regulation has come on, focusing mostly on environmental cleanup and rehab, but the increasingly stringent financial provisioning relinquishment criteria does mean we do have some success stories about successful closure. The work that have been done. This photo is from World Forestry Day, talking about the Alcoa's success in restoring the Jarrah forest in Western Australia. And there's been a lot of interesting work done on using old coal mines in Germany to convert it to green uses. This is an old coal mine that is being converted into a hydroelectric battery to store wind and solar energy. But we still continue to see problems, even with the most basic closure requirements of physical stability and chemical stability, and all the problems we know in South Africa around acid drainage. And there is a huge elephant in the room, which is that many mines never close. They just get passed down to smaller operators who have little or no capacity to deal with the enormous liabilities of long life mines. I thought I'd highlight a recent example, which gives you just an example of what's going on in coal. Rio Tinto in 2016 sold the Blair Atoll mine in Queensland, the coal mine, for the princely sum of $1 Australian to a small national player. At the time of the sale in 2016, one of the Rio Tinto people involved with the rehabilitation said that the rehab bond that was with the Queensland government, which was $80 million at the time, was probably about half the amount that would be required to do a successful rehab. But what we've seen in recent months is that the Queensland government has actually released some of that 80 million. It's calculated about 32 million of that bond is now being released to the company. So we're moving from a situation where we had money set aside for the rehab, which we knew wasn't enough. And we now have a smaller player who's managing to convince the Queensland government that they don't even need that amount of money to do the rehab. That story remains to play out, but it's an example of how even with the things that are well legislated and supposedly under control, we still are not having the success that we need. But let me turn to the social costs, because the social costs are huge and there's really no regulatory structure measuring around social economic impacts of closure. And we have very little knowledge about the extent of the social costs of closure. So there's much work to be done in this area if we're going to be talking about sustainable transitions to new economies. And it's not just about compensation for workers. These are some Turkish coal miners who've been laid off, but it's not about just their compensation, their reskilling, their early retirement. When we're talking about social costs, we want to be thinking about the well-being for the wider community affected by closure, the small businesses on the supply chain, the impact on the local economy, the impact on the well-being of the local community. And by well-being, I'm talking about their physical health and their mental health and their confidence and the support they're getting from various arms of government, both locally and nationally. But the current focus is still on the individual mine, and all the legislation is still really focused on what individual mining companies should be doing about the mine. And where we're going, I think, and I think Mike will talk about this in a minute with a specific case, is that we need to look at the scale, and we need to start considering regional approach, regional mine closure, which would foster regional economic development post-mining. If I can quote from somebody at the Chamber, at the Minerals Council of South Africa now, who said, "No mine can close independently of its neighbours. There is a need to rethink the kind of tools that we use to manage impacts. If a mine closes prematurely, that mine has impacts on its neighbours. Mines cannot have a standalone closure plan." But that's where we are today. So I think we really have to question how much work is being done around the regional economic development. And I think for that to be successful, governments have to take a lot more responsibility and be much more involved in the planning and implementing of mine closure plans and transitions. So in terms of summarizing what I had to say, 5 key points. Regulation continues to focus on the environmental cleanup and rehabilitation, but the social costs are incredibly important, and we have a lot of work to do around how we embed those in the regulatory structure, how we get companies to be transparent about the successes and challenges, and how we start to measure social costs of closure more successfully. One of the key problems in this, if you talk to the community development practitioners in the company, is that the time frames that we currently have in planning closure, our planning horizons are far too short, and we probably need something like a decade to really work to build the social capital that we need. And as we can see from the news today, these things don't normally give us the benefit of a decade of time. 4th point is that we really have to take a regional approach to closure, particularly where we have bunches of mines together, all closing and opening at various different levels, because the community around is not specifically tied to one mine. And finally, although we have still got all of the documentation and the talk is largely around what companies need to do around mine closure, we have to shift their responsibility to get governments more directly involved in the transitions we want. Okay, thank you. I'll stop the share and return to the chair.
Thank you so much, Caroline, for setting the scene and really giving some of those examples which really paint a vivid picture of all the dynamics. And I just want to remind everyone, if you've got any questions, we're going to have an open Q&A at the end. So please just post your questions in the chat group, and then the different panelists will address them at the end. And without further ado, I just want to hand over to Mike, who will now touch on post-mining economic succession planning. Mike, are you ready? Yes.
Yeah, thanks very much indeed, Tapiwa. The whole concept of economic succession planning in my minds goes around the fact that since the Burton Commission in the 1980s, we have looked at sustainable development, but the focus of mine closure has and still is on rehabilitation and not on social rehabilitation. So we're looking at laws in this country and other countries really focus on the need or the regulatory requirement to rehabilitate the mess that was made by mining, and don't look adequately at the social consequences of the mine closure. And just as a point of departure to this discussion, there is an environmental link in the fact that it is the greatest destroyer of environment is poverty, and not necessarily mining less. And so in closing a mine, you're only achieving partial remediation of the problem. You're not dealing with post-mining economic damage that is caused by poverty that's created by mine closure. I'm just going to go through a few slides, which I promised not to do, but I'm going to break my promise to Aysha. We've recently gone through the drafting of a national mine closure strategy with the Department of Mineral Resources mine closure team, facilitated by the Council for Geoscience. And they've accepted the principle of economic succession planning as being the guideline of the golden thread for a new mine closure strategy. So what economic succession planning effectively does is it looks at well in advance of mine closure. When a mine closes, at mine closure, it's too late to retread or to rehabilitate the mine in a sustainable way. So really we look at the fact that mine closure deals primarily with environmental remediation, but there's no legislation at all providing directly for post-mining sustainable future for mining dependent communities. And we've tried to address that. So the National Mine Closure Strategy looks at this question of what about the communities, what about the people? And the concept looks at the factors of production of the mine and recognizes that the land, infrastructure, water, and institutional capacity of a mine also lends itself for other forms of economy, and that this must be planned well in advance. If you look at that little graph on the right-hand side, that well in advance of mine closure, that that the alternative economies or transitional economies have got to be set in place so that they are established and have gained traction by the time that the mine actually closes. It's not an easy thing to do. There are cultural issues around the mines themselves. Caroline mentioned the ICMM, and the various organizations, representative organizations, have got it. They understand the need for social constructs around mine closure. The mining companies, if you look at Anglo American with Future Smart Mining and the SDG accountability dialogues, have also got it. They're doing a huge amount, making a huge amount of effort and spending a lot of money to look at the whole question of economy beyond mining. The problem is, a cultural problem, is that we do not have mentality within government at this particular juncture, or the institutional capacity within government to actually deal with the problems. And at the production level in mines, there's a complete disjuncture between what happens at a mine head office and actually what happens on the ground, because as things stand right now, incentive programs on mines do not accommodate things like carbon neutrality, greenhouse gas reduction, and economy beyond mining, and so that they don't get traction on the mines. This particular slide, this looks at the complexity of planning for economy beyond mining, is that one has got to look at the life cycle status of the mine before one starts even thinking of implementing and what is possible and what is not possible. There are the policy and regulatory aspects of it, and a good policy and good regulation is only as good as the implementation of the policy. And at the moment, we simply, within our government and many other governments, particularly in emerging economies, don't have the capacity to actually implement the regulations. So it's contingent on mining companies to actually strive towards legitimate social legitimacy and social license by going beyond compliance and doing what is right themselves. One has got to look in the planning for this at the whole question of remediation itself, of post-mining economy. And so what we're suggesting over here is that the post-mining economic planning should drive the rehabilitation. Obviously, rehabilitation is of key importance from an environmental perspective, but merely cleaning up the mine, and I am being a bit cynical about the ICMM video, Caroline, because in my career I've seen so many of these wonderful consulting engineers environmental plans with these lakes and yachts and boaties on the lakes, and actually it's bullshit, to be perfectly honest. One has got to look at the economic capacity and propensity of mines, and not just the trees and the birdies and the flowers and the boats. And this is not happening. So one has got to look at what the post-mining economic planning propensity for each mine is. Caroline mentioned quite rightly that this should not be done on a mine-by-mine basis. One has got to look at a regional basis for doing this, and that the mining closure programs should be integrated between mines at a regional level. And the question is, who's going to do that? Mines don't talk to each other, they don't communicate effectively. And this is the problem that we face. The financial provisioning is a big issue, is that most mining companies have environmental bonds, but the use of these environmental bonds, even with the financial provisioning within the new regulations, the new NEMA regulations, are inadequate, and there is absolutely no guidelines as to how that new financial provisioning is going to be used. The question of risk management, who's going to fall into the lake and drown, safety and health factors arising from the closure of the mine are big issues. At the end of the day, I'd like to go to the bottom line and look at the question of who is going to manage those programs. When mining companies close mines, they take down their tents and they leave town. So, and if we accept that governments don't have the capacity to do this, to manage programs, who's going to manage those programs? Who takes that responsibility? Who provides the funding? Who is accountable to whom? And what are the metrics for doing that? So looking at mine closure and economic succession planning, one has got to look at this construct of how do we, post-mining economic alternatives should drive environmental remediation that should result in positive social impact. What that requires at a social level, and one looks at the funding, there are something like 60 billion rand worth of financial provisioning available in this country for mine closure, and yet it's not being used because, as Tapiwa mentioned, one can't close the mine in this country. So there's not only the 60 billion rand financial provisioning, but there are the social and labor plans, which run into billions of rands a year, corporate social investment schemes that go to hundreds of millions of rands a year. And what we need to do is to align the environmental management programs towards post-mining economy, and then to fit in the CSI and SLP funding behind that as part of that construct into a single post-mining economic strategy. And that will basically ensure that that there's an alignment in terms of what the mining companies are doing at present and what is possible within a post-mining economy, but it also means that the funding is available within the current sources of funding, and that one doesn't need to necessarily impose greater rents on the mining companies. So what we're looking at is an aggregated economic construct that combines various current programs within mining regulation, and that these are pooled towards a common end goal. So I'd like to leave that at that and just talk about just let me stop the share, I beg your pardon, to get the technology right. At the end of the day, we're nowhere remotely near being able to plan for post-mining economy, but we do have the resources, we do have the funding. The mentality is certainly inculcating itself within the mining industry that we need to do things differently, and government is starting to catch up. And so this discussion that we're having today and similar discussions are vitally important in getting a broader thinking and a broader culture of post-mining economy. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mike, for highlighting how the different tools can really be integrated into achieving or working towards post-money economic succession planning. There are a number of questions which have been dropped in the chat room, and I think what we'll do is we'll address them all at the end, and the different panelists can tackle them. So just a reminder to the audience, please drop your questions in the chat room. Thank you, Mike. And for now, we'll hand over to Jesse, who's really now going to take us through just transitions and how that ties into the whole conversation. Thank you, Jesse.
Excellent. Thank you very much, and thanks everybody for having me. Can you all see that? Yes. So I'm going to step back from the mine level and touch on a lot of things that have already been raised. And thank you to Caroline and Mike for very interesting inputs. Just transition is a phrase that's kind of got a lot of political salience recently, but I don't think we should get too worried about definitions. There's as many definitions as there are pieces of string. What's important to understand is that all this talk about just transition, which aligns to global climate policy and South Africa's climate policy, I think already starts to address some of these problems around how to integrate national strategies around mining and mine closure and our economic development paradigm with mine level complexities around closure. So for me, what's really important is that South Africa is going to go through an energy transition in the coming decades in much the same way that most of the world is going to. Oh, I see the chat is flipping at me. Oh no, it's okay. And it's very important that our energy transition supports the developmental objectives of our country more broadly. So everybody's familiar with these, but I think it's important to remember we have 38% unemployment in general, 55% youth unemployment, and more than half of people in South Africa live in extreme poverty. So we need to address constraints to growth in a way that don't exacerbate any of these existing economic fragilities. And the concept of just transition is essentially that. It says it's very important that we address climate change issues and air pollution and other kinds of environmental justice problems, but it must be done in a way that doesn't leave mine workers and mining companies and mining communities behind, but it also means that we move as a world towards addressing climate change and energy justice and climate justice. So you don't want to make anything worse, and you need to find a way through to do that. It's obviously even more challenging in Mpumalanga. So Mpumalanga has unemployment levels that are above the national average. So it's more than 40% unemployment in the Mpumalanga province. And of course, in this COVID world that we now find ourselves in, South Africa is likely to go to over 50% unemployment. So it's very important that we find economic development strategies that are good for growth and good for jobs, while also trying to address some of these other problems. So other issues in Mpumalanga, there's obviously a lot of service delivery protests, you have mining affected communities, you have extreme levels of air and water pollution, you have competition for land, so you have competition between coal and housing and coal and agriculture in particular. And you have other kinds of challenges. So as coal plants and coal mines start to close, you start to see housing markets collapse, for example. So in Steve Chwete recently, I saw all these adverts outside the Spa for people trying to sell their houses in Pullens Hope, which is near Hendrina, one of the power plants that's closing first. 6-7 bedroom houses being sold for 500,000 Rand. People are desperate before we get a ghost town, because there isn't currently a plan for how to address impacted regions. There's also energy poverty. I mean, these are people who are picking coal off a small mine near Malahleni. So we need to plan, not only because, as Caroline said, every resource runs out, but because with coal in particular, you have a whole lot of other dynamics that are going to accelerate these processes. So coal transitions are happening everywhere in the world. The International Energy Agency, who are sort of seen as the most bullish on the future of the global coal export market, their estimate is that we have a flat flat exports over the next 20 years. Many independent analysts think that that's way too ambitious. It's because very large coal-using countries, for example, India or China, renewable energy is now cheaper than coal. So in a place like India, you have 60% of the coal fleet is more expensive to run than new renewables. Doesn't mean you're going to close all those plants immediately, but it means you're going to replace them and start to reduce your coal use quite significantly. India foresees more than half of its electricity by 2028 coming from renewable energy. Other large export markets for us, like Pakistan or South Korea, have got slightly different dynamics, but they're not growth markets. So at the same time that a mine would close and you know, you might think that's fine that these mining houses can absorb some of these risks and costs because this market is growing, that's not going to be there in the next 10 to 15 years. This is a study that looked at some of these transition risks and the extent to which they're out of the control of the South African government. So coal exports is one, but there are also others. It's well worth a read. In South Africa, I mean, it might just be easier to say this is too complicated. We don't know what to do. Coal seems like we should just keep going with coal. But the problem there is that renewable energy, like everywhere else in the world, is now just much cheaper than coal, and we can't afford to subsidize it anymore. So we can't afford to bail out Eskom over and over and over again. And load shedding and all these other problems mean that people will increasingly turn to alternatives. The cost differentials between renewables and coal are very large. So already in 2016, it was 40% more expensive to use to buy new coal than it was to buy new renewables, and it's about 3 to 4 times more expensive to buy electricity from Kusile and Medupi than it would be from new renewables. So for us to keep subsidizing those differences will be very difficult for developing country. So this transition is going to happen, and I think it's going to happen much faster than we think. You can see this is some modeling we did already by 2040, just on costs alone. This is no climate policy. Kusile doesn't run at full load. So a big mine like New Largo being built by Seriti, if they built it at their original spec, they would have a huge stranded asset problem. On top of all of these economic drivers, you also have climate policy. So South Africa has signed up to the Paris Agreement, but this is a global multilateral agreement which says that the whole world is going to work towards trying to stop dangerous anthropogenic interference in the climate system. What does that really mean? It means that we're going to try and limit warming to well below 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels and try and limit that to 1.5. We're at about 1.1 now. For coal, that means reducing from about 15 billion tons of CO2 of greenhouse gases per year to just above 3. If you take a more optimistic view, it's between a 50 and an 80% absolute reduction in coal use globally in the next 10 years. That's unprecedented. The rate and scale of that change will be very, very challenging for even a region to deal with. It requires national government to intervene, and it's more than a single mine can do either. So the transition is coming. How do we make it sure it's just and fair, both for workers and for communities in these regions where the whole value chain is potentially going to be disrupted, and including for informal women, informal workers like women who are selling food outside mines and coal truckers and that kind of thing. Our modeling shows we're going to fall in coal mining from about 80,000 workers today to about 24 in the mid 2040s without Paris Agreement compatible climate policy. That doesn't mean that 50,000 people are going to lose their jobs. It's very important now that we have to understand what plants and what mines will close when, and who are the workers in those spaces, because they're going to be aging as they go. So the timing and which mines close when is very, very important, and knowing the skills and the age profile of those workers matters, because maybe some need to be paid out early retirement and we have to think who's going to pay for that. Maybe some need to be redeployed between different firms even, so it's not just from this mine to that mine, both owned by Exaro. It's going to be bigger than that, and someone needs to coordinate that. And then much more fundamentally, you need to be retraining workers for post-coal futures, right? And then we come to kind of the next part of this, which is that it's not enough to just address workers, you have to address communities. And if you're going to retrain workers, what are you retraining them for? So where are we going in in regions like Mpumalanga? What is that future? And it could be some renewable energy, some agriculture, other kinds of manufacturing. There's not going to be a silver bullet. It's not just going to be like we go from coal to solar. That's not going to work. We're going to need a whole lot of different sectoral interventions, and we need and you're going to need growth in all of those. I mean, we need to get 43% of people who aren't working into work, as well as making sure that we don't leave coal miners who are losing their jobs behind. That's fundamentally what this is about, I think. I won't go into the detail of this. The ILO have got a globally agreed upon definition of just transition, which essentially does this. It just says we take very seriously that this is about industrial policy, economic development, and sustainable development more broadly. Yeah, so you want to look at how you protect livelihoods, how do you create decent work, and this kind of comes back to this mine level, you know, how we need to understand the labor market. We have to set a timeline. We have to think about who's going to pay bridges to pension and voluntary packages, who's going to transfer workers, who's going to coordinate SLP spend, ED and SED spend from new renewables firms, other kinds of local economic development initiatives that are already happening. You know, it's not like nothing's happening there. How do we make this work kind of in lockstep? And then, of course, you have to build an inclusive and resilient economy. So there's kind of different ways you can do that around, you know, finding competitiveness in particular value chains, finding firm level opportunities in places like eMalahleni. And for me, Mpumalanga has got a lot of advantages in that it's close to market. It's got good power infrastructure. It's got good transport links. It's got an industrial workforce who are relatively highly skilled, actually, compared to the rest of the economy. So I'll leave it there. There's actually a lot more in the slides, which I put in there so in case people are interested to look at it. But we can talk a little bit more about future energy plans and things in Mpumalanga. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jessie, for just, you know, really tying up the conversation and also pointing to how there won't be any, you know, simple solution. We just won't transition from one use to land use to the other, and also pointing to, you know, how reskilling and community development and really roles and responsibilities, how that really ties in. I think what we can do is there's some questions that have been dropped into the chat room that I can start off by maybe fielding the questions to some of the panelists, and the audience is also reminded, if you'd like to add on to some of the answers given and also bring up some points, you can raise your hand, and then Aysha will keep an eye on the audience, the participants who raise their hands, and if you want to participate, then you just unmute your mic, and also if you want to share your video, do that. One of the first questions here, which I think Caroline can address, is that mine closure for many multinationals, they are, I mean, you showed examples of successful transitions to different uses, especially globally in Australia, but on the continent in Africa, we've seen a lot of ghost towns, a lot of devastating impacts. What, in your view, do you think needs to happen that there are no double standards, and also how can those policies be implemented so that we do transition to clear post-mining sort of economies and uses that are very inclusive? So maybe Caroline, you can start by talking to that, and we can go and address some of the other questions.
Okay, thanks, Tapiwa. I'm not so sure that the multinationals have got mine closure right anywhere outside of Africa. There seems to be an assumption that somehow mine closure might be working better elsewhere, and that's not my experience at all. In fact, let's see, it must be 10 years ago now, we worked on a book called 101 Things to Do with the Hole in the Ground, and what it turned out was to us is that the best examples of post-mining land use were actually abandoned and orphaned mines that were subsequently attracted other industries to it and other opportunities. And one of the key things we have to understand is that mining companies are not very good at alternative economic activity. They've toyed with this idea of being development partners and working on broader socioeconomic development issues. But in fact, miners are miners, and why would we assume that they had any enthusiasm, passion, expertise to develop a whole set of other industries for post-mining? So I think we need to understand that the creation of ghost towns happened in Cornwall, in Virginia, in Western Australia, as much as it is happening in Africa. I want to draw people's attention back to the point I was trying to make about how quickly we have stepped up the game on mine closure, and how we literally 30 years ago did not even have this conversation. And then you talk about the time horizons that are necessary for success to happen. You then begin to understand that we're just at the very beginning of this journey. And so, whereas the multinationals, I mean, you know, the ICMM work may seem very high level, but if you look at the level of detail and the tools that they offer in their guidance now and in the Anglo-American guidance, it's very, very grassroots level. You could start on that if you were a very small mine in a very remote place with some of those checklists, etc. So I do think we're moving in the right direction. And I do think that some of this guidance has improved substantially, but we still haven't got anywhere near that thing that Mike was saying about mines don't talk to each other. There are very few examples. Actually, there are some good examples from South Africa. I think Sibanye and Goldfields have a very good joint project in the West Rand, looking at post-mining land use. But there are very few examples we have of where the companies are talking to each other successfully, let alone talking to the other local economic development agents. And that's where we need to go with this conversation.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that answer, Caroline. And I think one of the next questions which is quite an interesting question, is that maybe Mike can address this, is that how much more expensive would resource extraction be for us to really finance all these projects or post-mining transition? Like, how would we finance that? And I think that speaks to, you know, around financial provision, how that works. I think, Mike, you already showed some of the tools that can be leveraged to make that happen. Maybe, Mike, you can speak more about that question.
Tapiwa, one of the slides that I had there, and I'm not going to put it up again, but the fact is that the money is there. It's the question of how one utilizes the money and who utilizes the money. So Caroline raised, I think, the critically important point of regional integration is that geologically mines occur in clusters. And so if one looks at the statutory funding that is made available for social and labor plans, which are generally very, very poorly implemented by the district and local municipalities, but there are hundreds of millions of rands that are going into social and labor plans that are, to my mind, wasted. Corporate social investment money is generally subcritical and doesn't create sustainability. And then the financial provisioning through NEMA. So the money is available. What we are lacking at the moment are the implementing agents to make these things happen. And Caroline also mentioned the parcel syndrome that we have, where mines are passed on from the larger mining companies to the smaller mining companies, who at the end of the day neither have the institutional capacity or the intent of doing a proper job. What this suggests, and this is what we're examining in the National Mine Closure Strategy, and we hope to be ahead of the rest of the world in this, is looking at regional development agencies that are actually managed by the mining companies jointly with government, that can take over the financial provisioning for mining companies and do post-mining implementation on a continuous basis. But that also requires a regional approach. Incidentally, Caroline, the one example that you mentioned between Goldfields and Sibanya is not particularly successful. There are politics there involved as well. And so one has got to, we've come a long way. The dialogue, the rhetoric and narrative has changed as Caroline has mentioned. There are wonderful guidelines out there. It's a question of implementation, and that's the key thing that we have to address. Who is going to do it? Who's going to be accountable to whom? And ultimately, where does the responsibility lie, with government or with industry, or both?
Mm-hmm. That's interesting, Mike. I think one of the barriers that also comes out to really developing post-mining economies is around common goals and common visions for what the end use needs to look like. And I don't know if you can answer this. How can this be integrated into, regional land use planning on a local and national scale? What do you envision? How can some of these barriers be overcome to integrate that?
Part of what is required there is an intersectoral approach to this. And so one of the interesting new imperatives that we've got going in this country is the Limpopo Impact Catalyst, being based out of Polokwane, where national provincial government, along with 4 mining companies, the NGOs like World Vision and the CSIR are actually getting together in a joint planning and taking a joint planning approach to economic diversification around mining activity. So we're just starting on that journey, but it's critical that if we are going to look at post-mining economy, we've got to look at concurrent diversification, as I said, well in advance of mine closure, which means that we've got to take down the fences on mines. We've got to bring other sectors onto our mine sites, obviously observing health and safety issues, but it can be done. But at the moment, the mining industry and agricultural industry don't talk to each other because they hate each other. You've got government who've got their own agendas. So platforms or forums like the Impact Catalyst are vital. And I hope that we can actually extend or extrapolate the Impact Catalyst to other provinces, because it's that multi-sectoral forum where people are talking from a position of common interest as opposed to adversarial interest that we can get this right.
Yeah, I think what's really coming out is collaboration, and talking to each other. And I think maybe Jesse, you'd like to jump in. I see there's some dialogue between you and Jenny in the chat room about community conflict and labor interests. Maybe you want to speak to that in terms of just transitions. And what do you think are some of the solutions or barriers, or Jesse?
Sure, thanks. But also just to add onto Mike's point, I think we need to think very seriously about how to build those institutions. It's not enough to just hope that people will talk to each other. And this has happened in other places. In Australia, for example, when they closed the Hazelwood coal plant and mine, there was a huge pushback because it was announced very quickly. And so the provincial government created something called the Latrobe Valley Authority, which had the responsibility to coordinate both the worker transition and to think through long-term industrial and economic diversification strategies for the region, and to manage kind of some of the social infrastructure elements. So do we build community halls and that kind of thing? There it is simple. It's quite a small town. It was, only a few closures, but you need to think about how to build those kinds of institutions who can cut across sectors and who can leverage a lot of this funding, I think. On Jenny's point, yeah, that's my experience also. So communities in Mpumalanga and around coal mining, I can't speak about gold or anything else. I don't have any experience there, but their experience of coal mining is that it's extractive and exploitative, and their benefits are relatively small. It depends, of course, who you are and what part of the economy you're involved in. But for the most part, if you're involved in the informal economy in these regions, there's fear of closure because of kind of liquidity in the local economy drying up. But for the most part, your kids are sick, you can't work. Coal has brought you nothing but problems. So you see that the unions often say, and they're also right, that they are also part of the community and their interests are also community interests, But to me, there is a divide. What is happening in Mpumalanga at the moment is there's quite a lot of effort to bring unions, who in fact are the progenitors of the just transition concept. It comes from the labor movement because they saw the risks, and they also see a lot of inequality and kind of injustice in the way that economies work. Bringing them and the community back together to think together about what they want the future of the region to look like. And that's also a really important part of economic diversification, is how do you drive innovation? How did the cool ideas in the Latrobe Valley or the Ruhr region of Germany, where they've also had a lot of closures, how did those happen? In parts of Central and Eastern Europe, you know, they have dialogues with the community proposes projects that can be funded as part of the just transition. And we should start on that, I think, as we can, to kind of build that up before we start seeing accelerated coal closures. Yeah.
Thank you, Jessie, for that answer, really around encompassing just transitions. I think we have room for 2 more sort of questions, and the audience is also reminded that if you do want to participate in the conversation, just raise your hand, or you can just unmute your mic at this stage, I think. And I think one of the, maybe bringing it back to Caroline, there are a few comments in the chat room about have any mine closure certificates really been issued? And I know you and I, Caroline, have had this conversation about the whole care and maintenance and actual closing and actual certificates being issued. Caroline, maybe you want to speak to that. The question is, have any mine closures been approved? If yes, which, and for which mineral resources?
Yes, an interesting question. In every jurisdiction, whether you call it relinquishment certificates or closure certificates or whatever, it's what governments are very, very reluctant to give the final sign off to say you can walk away now. So it's a problem everywhere. In South Africa, the certificates are issued not for a whole mine. You apply for your certificate for specific facilities on the site. And I tried to have a look to see if I could find some numbers for you. But actually, the only ones I can find at the moment are from, in the year, when I looked at this in 2013-14, there were 575 relinquishment certificates under review, and 159 were issued. Now, a lot of those would have been at very, very small, not controversial mines with no long-term environmental problems. They may have been closing some waste dumps or whatever. So I don't think we're going to be able to point to any large-scale metal mine or coal mine where we can say, yes, a certificate has been issued in recent years. But there is some activity that the department isn't completely ignoring these. It's just that they are very reluctant to issue certificates that let people walk away for good reason.
Caroline, just to add to that, if I may, the only certificates that have been issued have been literally for borrow pits and small dump operations. That there have been no certificates issued for major mines. And of that, probably 70 to 80% of the refusal or the deference of mine closure certificates goes around water, which is acid mine drainage and other water issues. And it's not a simple question of the DMR issuing the mine closure certificate. There are also the Department of Environment, Department of Water Affairs and Sanitation that have got their go ahead as well. And to try and get that interdepartmental consensus on mine closures, which is possible. So the system is not working.
Yeah, that's true. I think the interdepartmental one is a key point there. And just leading the conversation to the next question, there's a question about how do we integrate small-scale artisanal mining into closure strategy, and how do governments deal with illegal miners? I think that's a very important one. Any one of the panelists can maybe address that. Or if one of the audience members also wants to step in, you can raise your hand on speaking about integrating small-scale mining into closure strategy. Bernard, you have your, okay, Mike, you want to go
Just a
first?
quick one.
Yeah.
It's a major problem because one has got to differentiate between the illegal zama issue, which is not good, and that leads to, that's driven by organized crime with huge health and safety risks, and the whole question of secondary mining. And so, from a regulatory perspective, what we're trying to do is just to pass the buck to security services, to the police force for the illegal mining. But the fact is that mining never actually ceases. There's always a residual value in mining, be it stone for construction from mine dumps or for the scavenging from. But it's got to be done on a very, very managed basis, and it's a very, very difficult problem to accommodate from a regulatory perspective. But one has got to plan secondary mining into a mine closure equation in any sort of situation.
That's true. Bernard, I see you have your hand up. Just a quick one because the session is almost coming to an end, but you can turn on your mic and unmute. Bernard?
Yes, thank you. I actually had, it's sort of a comment, but also a question for Mike. When he mentioned the idea of development post-mine closure or rehabilitation, I found that very interesting. And I started thinking, as I thought about, the question I want to bring to him is, if he has been able to identify reasons why things, that development process is not taking place. I remember one thing he said, there is money for it. And immediately it makes me think, if there is money, what is it that is lacking? Is it political will or any other thing? The reason why I ask, because as a lawyer, when I think about this, I'm asking, okay, if I want to influence, or if law has to be made for this, as his slides suggested, one has to understand what is even impeding that process at the moment, so that when you make law, you make sure the law will address those issues. Thank you.
Mike, I think you have your mic muted there.
I beg your pardon. Very quickly, financial provisioning makes sure that mining companies have the funds set aside for mine closure. But if they don't use the funding and they leave the funding for government to use, so the idea is that if the mining company defaults, government will pick up the pieces. There are no mechanisms in the law at the moment for the DMR to actually access those funds and to actually use them on the ground. It's a crazy situation, but we're addressing that at the moment. And who are the implementing agents? In the NEMA, the amendments to NEMA, there are 4 mechanisms for mine closure funding, Bernard. One is to deposit money interest-free, mine closure money with the department, which nobody in their right minds would do, and I don't think anybody does. You've got to put money into a sinking fund, which is managed by the mining company, but approved in a mechanism, instrument approved by government. There's the gap closure insurance, which benefits the shareholders of insurance companies, but nobody else. Because in my experience, or to my knowledge, nobody's ever drawn down on that gap insurance. And there are hundreds of millions of rands a year that are being paid into Lombardi Insurance and Guard Risk and other companies, Centric, for these instruments. And then the 4th one is a thing called a mine closure rehabilitation company. And nobody has defined what a mine closure rehabilitation company actually means. So Tapiwa, just as so possibly to close the session, there's a regulatory or policy provision for that regional agency that Caroline and I have spoken to, but nobody's actually defined as to how to use it or to get the money out of the pots, the 60 billion rand, into a vehicle that can be constructively used.
Thank you so much, Mike. And I think we've come to the end of our session. I would just like to thank the panelists for really putting forward key aspects around the conversation and really bringing attention to the different things that need to happen: collaboration, multi-stakeholder engagement, and how we need to look at financial provision for, building post-mining economies. And with that, I'd like to thank everyone for attending. Thank you so much, and thank you to the panelists.
Thank you, Tapiwa. That was a great session. Thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Tapiwa, so much. That was very enlightening. I'm going to save the chat. I can see there's some interesting back and forth there that could be useful for people watching the recording later. So I'll share that as well. But yeah, thank you so much, Tapiwa. Great job. Amazing. Thank you.
Till next week, I suppose.
Yes.
Yes.